They say grief exposes the true face of family, but nothing could have prepared me for the moment I buried my 12-year-old son and looked around only to realize that not a single member of my own bloodline had shown up. The church pews were half empty, filled with kind neighbors, distant colleagues, even people I barely knew from the community, all quietly offering condolences, while the people who were supposed to stand by me in my darkest hour were boarding a plane to Mexico, flaunting their $8,000 vacation online as if life had never been kinder. My hands shook as I watched my sister's Instagram story play on loop, palm trees swaying, cocktails clinking, her caption reading, "Sometimes you just need to escape reality." Reality. My reality was a coffin that looked too small, flowers that smelled too sweet, and a silence that pressed on my chest like a weight I could not breathe under. Every mother imagines standing in a crowd at their child's graduation, not standing at the edge of a grave. And yet, as I lowered him down, the echoes of laughter from a luxury resort became the background noise of my mourning, reminding me with every second that my family had chosen sunshine over sorrow, pleasure over presence. I felt something break inside me that day, something final, something that would never be repaired, and I promised myself I would never forgive them for what they had done. I remember the exact moment the betrayal sank in, not as a sharp stab, but as a slow-burning ache, like acid eating away at my insides. The priest's voice faded, the sobs of strangers blurred, and all I could see was my mother's last text message. "We just can't handle the heaviness right now. You should understand. She deserves this trip more than anyone." By she, my mother meant my sister, the eternal golden child, the one who had never lifted a finger to help me when my boy was sick, the one who spent her days chasing luxury while I scraped together money for hospital bills. And yet, my family spoke as if I were the selfish one, expecting them to sit in the rain at a funeral instead of sipping margaritas by the pool. The truth is, this wasn't new. My son had been in and out of hospitals since he was 7, and I fought every battle alone. When his lungs collapsed last winter, I slept on a stiff plastic chair for 3 nights, begging my family for support. My calls went unanswered, my messages ignored, until weeks later when my sister posted about her life-changing spa retreat. They had always made excuses, always chosen comfort over commitment, but I told myself that death changes people, that loss would finally pull us together. I was wrong. Standing by that coffin, I realized I was the only one who ever believed in family as something more than a word. After the funeral, I drove home in silence, gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. The sound of the rain on the windshield louder than my own thoughts. I didn't turn on the radio. I didn't answer the phone when neighbors called to check in. I sat in my driveway staring at the front door of my house, the same door my son used to burst through after school with muddy shoes and a backpack bouncing against his shoulders. Now it was just a door, a barrier between me and a hollow shell of memories. Inside, his drawings still hung on the refrigerator, his sneakers were kicked off near the couch, and the smell of his shampoo lingered in the bathroom. I collapsed on the floor and sobbed until my ribs ached. But even in that moment of unbearable grief, the thought that kept clawing at me was not only that I had lost him, it was that my own flesh and blood had chosen to erase him from their story. My family's betrayal became louder than my grief, because I could not understand how people who shared my blood could live with themselves, laughing in swimsuits on white sand beaches while their grandson, nephew, cousin was lowered into the ground. They didn't just abandon me, they abandoned him. In the weeks that followed, I received no calls, no letters, not even a single bouquet of flowers from them. All I saw were their vacation posts, my sister in a wide-brimmed hat holding a designer bag, my mother floating in a pool with her cocktail, captions filled with hashtags like "living my best life" and "blessed." And then came the message that broke me all over again. My brother sent a group text. "You need to stop making us feel guilty. Dwelling on death isn't healthy. We all grieve in different ways." Different ways. Their version of grief was room service, snorkeling trips, and luxury shopping sprees. Mine was waking up at 3 a.m. reaching for a child who wasn't there, staring at an empty chair at the dinner table, listening to the silence of a house that used to be alive with laughter. I started to wonder if they had ever loved him at all, or if love, for them, had always been a conditional performance, something that existed only when it was convenient, never when it cost them comfort. And that thought planted a seed of rage in me. It wasn't just disappointment anymore. It wasn't sadness. It was something colder, sharper, more dangerous, Because once you realize your family is capable of erasing the memory of your child, you stop caring about keeping the peace. You stop caring about being the forgiving daughter, the accommodating sister. That day, I knew a line had been crossed, and there was no going back. The first time I saw them face to face after the funeral was 2 months later, when they came back from their trip glowing with tans and shopping bags. My sister strutted into my mother's kitchen wearing a silk sundress, clicking her manicured nails on the countertop as she bragged about the life-changing clarity she'd found in Cabo. She spoke like she'd survived some great hardship, like her sun-soaked vacation was a spiritual cleanse, while I stood there with shadows under my eyes, a body 10 pounds lighter from grief, and hands that still shook when I looked at my son's empty room. My mother didn't hug me, didn't even look me in the eye. She just launched into stories about the resort, the buffets, the luxury suite upgrade. I sat frozen, trying to process the fact that they had stepped back into this house like nothing had happened, like there hadn't been a grave dug while they sipped cocktails. When I finally spoke, my voice came out flat. "You missed his funeral." The room went quiet for half a second, but then my sister smirked and said, "We all grieve differently. You chose tears, we chose healing. Don't punish us for taking care of ourselves." My ears rang. Healing? Healing was holding my son's favorite hoodie at night just to feel close to him. Healing was begging the universe for one more moment, one more laugh, one more hug. Their healing was erasing him, covering his memory with selfies and suntans. And the worst part? They actually believed they had done nothing wrong. They looked at me like I was the problem, like I was dramatic, ungrateful, bitter. That's when something inside me snapped, not in a loud, screaming way, but in a cold, calculated one. I realized I had spent my whole life begging for scraps of love and approval from people who would never see me, never respect me, never honor what mattered most to me. My son had deserved better, and so did I. I stopped speaking to them after that day. But silence didn't mean peace. They still found ways to invade my grief, turning it into something performative and shallow. My sister began posting long captions on social media about how family tragedy had taught her to appreciate life more, painting herself as some kind of survivor while she flaunted new designer shoes and spa packages. Not once did she mention my son's name. Not once did she acknowledge the little boy whose absence was the reason for all of this. My brother, on the other hand, took it upon himself to send me unsolicited advice texts, insisting that clinging to sorrow is toxic and suggesting I take a yoga retreat like he had. The audacity left me speechless. I had buried a child, my child, and they thought I needed a weekend getaway to fix it. But the final straw came when my mother called me one evening, her voice light, casual, almost cheerful. "We've been talking," she said, "and we think it's time you move on. Dwelling isn't healthy. Maybe pack up his room, donate his things, start fresh." It's what he would have wanted. My knees nearly buckled. I stared at the walls of my son's bedroom, at the posters he had taped up with crooked hands, at the books lined on the shelf, at the video game controller still resting on his desk, and I realized what she was asking of me wasn't about healing, it was about erasure. They wanted me to wipe him away like he never existed, to make their lives easier so they wouldn't have to face the discomfort of my grief. That's when something hardened inside me, a clarity I had never known before. For years, I had excused their selfishness, convinced myself that one day they would change, that one day they would show up. But now, the truth was undeniable. They never would. They had chosen themselves over him, and by doing so, they had severed whatever fragile bond had tied us together. I knew then that I had to make a choice, not for them, not even for myself, but for my son. His memory deserved loyalty. His life deserved honor. And if my family couldn't give him that, then I would. Even if it meant standing alone. Even if it meant cutting every last tie. Because some betrayals are too deep to forgive, and this one had carved a canyon in my chest that no apology, no excuse, no vacation could ever bridge again. I started documenting everything, not out of spite at first, but out of a desperate need to hold on to the truth. I saved every message, every social media post, every smug comment they made about how their vacation had been worth it. I printed screenshots and tucked them into a folder labeled with my son's name because I refused to let their version of events overwrite reality. They wanted to rewrite the story as if I were the bitter one who couldn't move on, but I wasn't going to let them distort what really happened. At night, when the house was too quiet, I would sit at his desk and write letters to him, telling him about the betrayal, telling him how proud I was of him, how much I loved him, and how I would make sure his memory was never treated like an inconvenience again. Those letters became my strength. They were proof that I wasn't crazy, that I wasn't the selfish one, no matter how many times my family tried to gaslight me into believing it. Slowly, that clarity hardened into resolve. I realized I didn't owe them explanations. I didn't owe them forgiveness, and I certainly didn't owe them my silence. So, when my sister invited me to her birthday dinner 3 months later, acting as though nothing had happened, I showed up. Not with a smile, but with the folder. I sat at the table while they laughed over wine and fancy appetizers, and then I slid the folder across to my mother. "This is who you are," I said quietly. "This is what you chose." For the first time, I saw their faces falter. My sister tried to joke. My brother muttered something about me being too dramatic. But my mother's eyes lingered on the screenshots, the timelines, the proof that they had abandoned their grandson while celebrating themselves. And I knew in that moment that I had taken back the power. They could twist the narrative in public all they wanted, but the truth was there, undeniable, staring them in the face. It wasn't yelling. It wasn't revenge in the dramatic sense. It was something colder, cleaner. Documentation, boundaries, evidence. The very things they couldn't erase. After that night, they began avoiding me, which suited me just fine. No more half-hearted phone calls, no more unsolicited advice, no more pretending we were still a family. They called me cold behind my back, said I was heartless for cutting ties, but I didn't care. What kind of family abandons a grieving mother and then demands her silence? I had lived too long in their shadow, bending myself into pieces to earn love that was never unconditional, never consistent, always transactional. Now the illusion was gone. My son's memory had burned it away. But the strange part was what came next. The community I never expected to catch me when I fell. Neighbors who had shown up at the funeral began stopping by with groceries, with handwritten notes, with quiet company on nights when the silence was too much. One of his teachers came over with a stack of his school projects she had saved, saying she wanted me to have them because he was unforgettable. Even the mailman, a man I'd barely exchanged words with before, paused one morning to tell me how sorry he was and how deeply my son's smile had stuck with him. Strangers remembered him more than my own family did, and that realization both shattered me and healed me at the same time, because it proved that my boy had left his mark, that his life had mattered, even if the people who should have cherished him most refused to see it. So I poured my energy into preserving him, making photo albums, recording videos, setting up a small scholarship in his name with the little money I had. Each act of remembrance was an act of defiance against my family's erasure, and with each step, I felt myself getting stronger, colder, more certain. They could keep their vacations, their excuses, their empty claims of different ways of grieving. I had something they could never take back: the truth, the memory, the love. And I would guard it with every breath left in me. Months turned into a year, and the distance between me and my family became permanent, like a wound that scabbed over but would never truly heal. They still tried occasionally, half-hearted invitations to holidays, texts dripping with guilt like, "You can't isolate yourself forever," or "He wouldn't want you to be bitter." I ignored them, because I knew every word was just another attempt to shift the blame back onto me. They weren't reaching out to reconnect. They were reaching out to soothe their own guilt, to paint themselves as the kind of people who had at least tried. But I didn't need them anymore. I had built my own circle, small but genuine. I started attending a support group for grieving parents, and for the first time, I sat in a room where people didn't flinch at the word death. They didn't look away when I spoke about my son. They leaned in. They remembered details week after week. They cried with me, laughed with me when I shared a funny story about his quirks. In that space, my grief wasn't inconvenient, it was understood. And that gave me something my family never could: validation. The more I surrounded myself with real compassion, the clearer my past looked. I began to see my family not as a tragic loss, but as an overdue shedding, like stepping out of clothing that no longer fit. I stopped checking their social media, stopped wondering if they would ever apologize, because even if they did, it would never be enough. Nothing could change the fact that they chose an $8,000 vacation over the funeral of a 12-year-old boy. Nothing could erase that moment in the church when I looked around and saw empty pews where their faces should have been, and nothing could ever convince me that people capable of such cruelty deserved another chance to hurt me. I had carried them all my life, hoping one day they would change. But grief taught me the hardest truth of all. Sometimes the people you're born to are not your family. Sometimes you have to build your own from the ashes. And that's exactly what I was doing. The breaking point came when my sister, bold as ever, showed up at my door unannounced with shopping bags in her hands and a smile stretched too wide. She acted like nothing had happened, like there wasn't a canyon of betrayal between us, and chirped, "I thought you could use a little cheering up." Out of the bag, she pulled a cheap trinket from her vacation, an oversized sombrero she'd bought at an airport gift shop. She placed it on my counter as if it were some grand offering, as if a plastic souvenir could fill the void of a child's absence. My chest tightened with rage so sharp I thought it would split me open. I told her to take it and leave. She blinked, offended, muttered that I was still being dramatic, and actually tried to lecture me on how holding grudges ruins lives. That was it. I stepped closer, my voice steady, cold. "You abandoned your nephew's funeral for a vacation. You abandoned me. You don't get to walk back into my home and act like nothing happened. You don't get to rewrite this." For the first time, she went silent. Her cheeks flushed, her eyes darted to the floor, and in that silence, I felt something shift. She had always been the one with the upper hand, smirking, dismissing, twisting words, but not anymore. I had finally spoken the truth out loud, stripped of excuses, stripped of fear. And once it was said, I knew there was no taking it back. She left that night, slamming the door behind her, and I knew deep down she would run straight to my mother, to my brother, spinning her version of the story as she always did. But I didn't care. Let them talk. Let them call me bitter, cruel, heartless. I wasn't any of those things. I was a mother who had stood alone at her child's grave, and the people who should have been there had chosen cocktails and white sand. That wasn't my shame, it was theirs. And for the first time in my life, I felt free from their grip. Weeks later, the calls started again, not warm or apologetic, but sharp, filled with accusations. My mother's voice on the line was cold, clipped. "You're tearing this family apart with your stubbornness. Do you want to be alone forever?" I let her words hang in the silence before answering. "You tore this family apart the day you chose Cabo over your grandson's funeral." She sputtered. Tried to twist it into something about self-care and different grieving styles. But I didn't let her finish. I hung up, and with that single click, I realized something I should have understood long ago. Family isn't measured by blood, but by presence. By who shows up when the ground beneath you crumbles. By who stands beside you when you're too broken to stand alone. My so-called family had failed that test in the most brutal way possible, and in their failure, they revealed themselves as strangers I no longer needed. I stopped waiting for apologies, stopped bracing myself for their next attempt to rewrite the past. Instead, I redirected that energy into something bigger, honoring my son in ways they never could. I organized a charity run in his name, something small at first. Just neighbors, teachers, parents from his old soccer team, but it grew, word spreading faster than I expected. Soon local businesses were sponsoring, people I had never met before were donating, and suddenly his name was spoken with pride. His memory kept alive not by blood relatives, but by a community that cared. Standing at that starting line, holding the banner with his picture, I felt a surge of love so strong it eclipsed the bitterness. For once, my grief wasn't laced with rage. It was fueled by purpose. And that's when it struck me. My family had tried to erase him, but in their absence, others had stepped in to make sure he would never be forgotten. Their betrayal had given me clarity, and clarity gave me freedom. And once you taste freedom from lies, from manipulation, from begging for scraps of love, you don't ever go back. It's strange how betrayal can sharpen your vision. How once you stop making excuses for people, you see every detail you used to ignore. Looking back, the pattern was always there. The way my mother dismissed my son's hospital stays as overreactions. The way my sister mocked me for being too dramatic when I begged them for help. The way my brother acted like sending a meme was the same as support. They were never really there, not when he was alive, and not when he was gone. And yet I had spent years bending myself into knots, desperate for them to show even a fraction of the love I poured out. But grief stripped me raw, peeled away every illusion until I was left with one undeniable truth. They didn't deserve me, and they didn't deserve him. The night after the charity run, I sat alone on the porch, the banner with my son's name still folded in my lap, and I thought about how far I'd come. There had been a time when I thought I couldn't survive without my family, when I thought their approval was oxygen. But now I was breathing just fine without them. Better even. My house was quiet, but it was a sacred quiet, not the suffocating silence they had left me with. It was filled with memories I chose to preserve, with laughter caught on old videos, with drawings taped proudly to walls instead of tucked away in boxes like they wanted. I realized I wasn't just grieving my son anymore, I was grieving the family I thought I had, the one that never truly existed. And oddly enough, that grief set me free. I stopped answering their calls entirely. When my sister sent yet another message dripping with false concern, "Mom's health isn't good. It's cruel of you to keep punishing us." I didn't reply. When my brother tried to tag me in a post about family first, I blocked him. When my mother left a voicemail saying I was turning into a bitter, lonely woman, I deleted it without a second thought. Their words no longer pierced me because they no longer mattered. What mattered was my son, his memory, and the life I was building in his honor. What mattered was the proof that love can exist outside bloodlines, that community can fill the void left by betrayal. And what mattered most was the quiet, steady strength I had found inside myself, the strength to stand alone, to speak truth, to walk away. They thought their absence would break me. Instead, it revealed who I was always meant to be, a mother who refuses to let her child be erased, and a woman who will never again beg to be chosen. A 1.5 years has passed now, and I no longer measure time in days since the funeral, but in milestones of healing. I've built a new rhythm, one where my mornings start with a quiet walk past the park where my son once played, and evenings end with lighting a candle by his picture. His room is still intact, not because I'm stuck in the past, but because it feels like a sanctuary, a place where his presence lingers strongest. And for once, I don't feel guilty about holding on. My family would call it dwelling, but I call it remembering. They wanted me to pack up his things and erase him from sight so they could live without discomfort. But I've learned that grief isn't meant to be hidden. It's meant to be carried, honored, transformed into something bigger than pain. And that's exactly what I've done. The scholarship fund in his name now helps other children, kids who remind me of his stubborn spirit and bright smile. Strangers write to me about how his story has inspired them to hug their kids tighter, to be present, to never take time for granted. My son lives on in ways my family never imagined, and certainly never contributed to. They remain absent, orbiting on the edge of my life, occasionally sending hollow messages that I no longer even bother to open. I know what they want. They want absolution without accountability, forgiveness without change. But I am done giving them anything, especially pieces of myself. My revenge, if you can call it that, has been simple. Living a life where they no longer exist in my story, where their betrayal has no power, where their absence is not a wound, but a blessing. They chose an $8,000 vacation over a funeral, and that choice will haunt them long after it has set me free. I have stopped asking if I was too harsh, stopped questioning whether I should have given them another chance. The truth is plain. Some betrayals close doors forever, and that's not cruelty. It's survival. My son deserved loyalty, and now so do I. And if there's one lesson I carry forward, it's this. Blood might tie you to people, but love is proven in presence. And when I stood alone at that graveside, surrounded not by family but by neighbors, teachers, and friends, I finally understood who my real family was. I am not broken anymore. I am not begging anymore. I am not theirs anymore. I am my own, and I am his forever.